Tonight, we travel back in time to uncover the story of how medieval people survived the coldest winters without the heating systems we take for granted today. Before we begin, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Imagine this. You wake in absolute darkness. Your breath hangs visible in the frigid air, even though you're inside your home. Frost has formed on the inside of your window. When your feet touch the floor, there's no warm carpet, just frozen earth or rough wooden boards that feel like ice burning against your skin. This was reality for millions of people throughout the medieval period. But here's what might surprise you. They didn't just survive these brutal winters. They developed ingenious strategies that allowed entire civilizations to thrive through conditions that would kill most of us within days. Perhaps you're tucked beneath a warm duvet right now in a heated bedroom. Maybe you've just adjusted your thermostat without a second thought. Hold on to that feeling of warmth for a moment, because the story we're about to explore will take you to a world where warmth wasn't a switch away, but a precious resource that required constant vigilance, remarkable ingenuity, and the kind of endurance most of us will never need to discover in ourselves. Winter wasn't merely an inconvenience for medieval people. It was a season that tested the very limits of human survival. A season that killed. And yet, they found ways to sleep through frozen nights, to raise children in smoky one-room cottages, to endure months of darkness with nothing but flickering firelight. Tonight, you'll discover secrets that have been lost to time, how they created warmth from almost nothing, why sleeping with strangers wasn't just common, it was essential for survival, the miracle fibre that made winter endurance possible, and the psychological strategies that kept people sane through months of cold and darkness that would break most modern minds. So settle in, get comfortable in whatever warmth surrounds you, and prepare to discover how your ancestors survived what we could not. We often romanticize the medieval period with images of cozy taverns and crackling hearth fires, of knights in gleaming armour and ladies in flowing gowns. But the truth of medieval winter was far more brutal and far more fascinating than our comfortable fantasies suggest. This was an era when the simple act of staying warm enough to survive until spring required knowledge passed down through generations, communal cooperation, and a level of physical hardship that would astonish most people living in the developed world today. The medieval period itself stretched across 1,000 years and encompassed vast geographical regions, from the sun-warmed Mediterranean to the frozen reaches of Scandinavia, from the British Isles with their damp, penetrating cold, to the continental extremes of Central and Eastern Europe. Each region developed its own strategies for winter survival, its own wisdom about how to coax warmth from reluctant materials, how to preserve the precious heat generated by fire and body, how to endure the long, dark months when the sun barely climbed above the horizon before beginning its descent once more. But regardless of region, regardless of whether you were a peasant huddled in a one-room dwelling or a noble residing in a stone castle, winter in the medieval world meant cold in ways we've forgotten how to comprehend. It meant accepting discomfort as a constant companion for months on end. It meant understanding that survival itself was never guaranteed, that a failed harvest, an unusually severe winter, or simply a run of bad luck could mean the difference between seeing another spring or becoming another statistic in the brutal arithmetic of medieval mortality. Let us begin this journey into the cold heart of the medieval winter, starting with the climate itself and what it meant to face winter in an age before central heating, before modern insulation, before the countless small conveniences that shield us from the raw reality of winter's power. The climate our medieval ancestors faced was not the stable, predictable system we might imagine. Beginning in the early 14th century and extending well into the 19th, Europe experienced what climatologists now call the Little Ice Age, a period when temperatures dropped significantly below the medieval average, and winter's grip grew even more fierce than in previous centuries. During the height of the Little Ice Age, particularly between the years 1645 and 1715, average winter temperatures in Europe and North America dropped by as much as 2 degrees Celsius compared to previous centuries. This might not sound dramatic to our modern ears, accustomed as we are to adjusting thermostats by much larger margins with a simple twist of a dial. But in a world without modern heating, without the ability to generate warmth at will, a drop of 2 degrees meant the difference between merely uncomfortable and genuinely life-threatening cold. The Baltic Sea, which rarely freezes in our current climate, became solid ice during medieval winters. Rivers throughout Europe froze so thoroughly that people could walk, ride horses, and even hold markets on their frozen surfaces. The Thames in London froze repeatedly, with the first recorded frost fair taking place in 1608. Imagine the river that flows through one of Europe's greatest cities transformed into a solid highway of ice, solid enough to support not just pedestrians but entire festivals, with people roasting oxen and printing pamphlets on the frozen water itself. But the Little Ice Age was not simply about colder temperatures. It brought increased variability and unpredictability to weather patterns. Winters could arrive early and linger late, extending the period during which warmth was desperately needed. The growing season shortened, sometimes by several crucial weeks, meaning that the harvest that had to sustain families through the winter was smaller, providing less abundance to draw upon during the lean months. Yet even before the onset of the Little Ice Age, medieval winters were formidable challenges. The period from roughly 900 to 1300 CE, sometimes called the medieval warm period, was indeed somewhat milder than what followed, but warm is a relative term. Even during this supposedly balmy era, winter in northern and central Europe meant months of cold that would test anyone accustomed to modern comforts. We must remember that medieval people had no thermometers, no weather forecasts, no scientific understanding of why winter came or when it might end. They measured cold not in degrees but in its effects, in the thickness of ice on the water bucket, in the number of livestock that survived until spring, in the ability to keep fingers and toes from freezing during necessary outdoor work, in the simple question of whether you could maintain enough warmth to sleep through the night without the risk of never waking. The experience of cold varied dramatically depending on geography. In Scandinavia, winter brought months of genuine darkness, with the sun barely appearing above the horizon for weeks on end. Temperatures plummeted to levels that made any outdoor activity a test of endurance. The cold there was dry and crystalline, the kind that made metal burn to the touch and turned breath into ice crystals that tinkled softly in the still air. In the British Isles, by contrast, cold came with dampness, a penetrating chill that worked its way through layers of clothing and seemed to settle into bones and joints. The cold there was less extreme in absolute temperature, but perhaps more miserable in its persistence, in the way moisture carried the chill deeper, making it harder to ever feel truly warm even when sitting near a fire. In the mountainous regions of the Alps and Pyrenees, winter brought not just cold but also the very real danger of being cut off entirely from the outside world by snow that could bury entire villages, making roads impassable for months at a time. Communities in these regions had to be entirely self-sufficient from first snowfall to spring thaw, with no possibility of resupply or assistance if stores ran low. Along the Mediterranean coast, winters were milder but still presented challenges. Even in regions where snow was rare, temperatures dropped enough that heating was necessary, and the architectural traditions of these warmer regions often left homes less prepared for cold than the heavier construction common farther north. A cold snap in these regions could catch people unprepared, their homes lacking the massive fireplaces and thick walls that northern dwellings incorporated as a matter of course. Understanding this climatic context is essential because it shaped every aspect of how medieval people approached the challenge of winter survival. The strategies they developed were not quaint historical curiosities, but sophisticated responses to a genuine threat. Winter killed. It killed livestock, destroying the wealth and food security of entire communities. It killed crops in the fields if it arrived too early. It killed travellers caught unprepared on the road. And it killed anyone, peasant or noble, who failed to take adequate precautions against its power. Medieval chronicles are filled with references to particularly severe winters, described with a mixture of awe and terror. Chroniclers recorded years when wine froze in cellars, when birds fell dead from the sky, when the cold was so intense that people lost fingers and toes even while staying indoors. These were not exaggerations meant to dramatize, but sober accounts of winters that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. The cold also had profound economic and social impacts. Winters that lingered too long could destroy spring planting, leading to failed harvests and famine the following year. Severe cold made travel dangerous or impossible, disrupting trade and communication. In a world where local economies were dominant and most communities produced most of what they consumed, a harsh winter that depleted stores could set off a cascade of hardship that might take years to recover from. But medieval people were not passive victims of their climate. They observed patterns, developed strategies, and passed down knowledge through generations about how to read weather signs, how to prepare for winter, how to endure its worst manifestations. Much of this knowledge was unwritten, embedded instead in the daily practices and seasonal rhythms that governed medieval life. They knew, for instance, that certain behaviors of animals predicted the severity of the coming winter. If squirrels gathered unusually large stores of nuts, if horses grew particularly thick winter coats, if birds migrated earlier than usual, these were signs that nature itself was preparing for a harsh season. Modern science might question the reliability of such indicators, but for medieval people, this experiential knowledge was crucial for survival. They also understood the calendar of winter with an intimacy we've lost. They knew exactly how many weeks of severe cold they could typically expect, when the worst storms usually arrived, when the first hints of spring might appear. This knowledge allowed them to ration food and fuel, to plan their work, to maintain hope during the darkest and coldest periods by knowing that change would eventually come. The reality of medieval winter, then, was one of cold that was not just uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous, that shaped architecture and agriculture, social structures and daily routines, that required constant attention and effort to survive. It was a cold that we, living in our heated homes with our thermostats and insulated walls, can scarcely imagine. Yet it was within this brutal reality that medieval people found ways not just to survive but to maintain communities, to raise children, to pursue crafts and arts, to create the civilization that would eventually develop the technologies that shield us from winter's full power. Now let us descend from the abstract realm of climate and temperature into the lived reality of how medieval people actually faced these challenges, starting with the humblest dwellings and the ingenious, often desperate strategies employed by those with the least resources to protect them from the cold. The vast majority of medieval Europeans were peasants, and for these common folk, winter survival began with the structure they called home. These dwellings bore little resemblance to what we think of as houses today. They were small, often consisting of a single room where an entire family, parents, children, perhaps elderly relatives, lived, worked, ate, and slept in the same space throughout the long winter months. The construction of a typical peasant dwelling evolved over the medieval period and varied by region, but certain elements were nearly universal. The walls might be made of wattle and daub, an ancient technique where wooden frames were filled with woven branches or reeds, then plastered over with a mixture of clay, mud, straw, and sometimes animal dung. Once dried, this created surprisingly sturdy walls, though they offered limited insulation against cold. In regions where timber was abundant, homes might be constructed primarily of wood, with thick logs hewn and fitted together, gaps sealed with moss, mud, or whatever materials were available. In areas where stone was plentiful, peasant homes might incorporate stone walls, which provided better protection from wind but could be terribly cold to the touch, and required more sophisticated techniques to make watertight. The roofs were almost universally thatched, made from straw, reeds, or heather, depending on what grew locally. A well-made thatched roof was remarkably effective at keeping out rain and providing some insulation, as the thick layer of plant material trapped air and created a barrier against heat loss. However, thatch required constant maintenance and could be damaged by severe weather or snow load, and it was desperately vulnerable to fire, a constant concern in dwellings where open flames were a necessity for survival. The floors of peasant homes were usually packed earth, sometimes strewn with rushes or straw that could be changed periodically. The better homes might have wooden floorboards, raised slightly off the ground to reduce dampness, but this was a luxury beyond the means of many. The earth floors, while humble, actually had some advantages in terms of thermal mass. They absorbed warmth during the day and released it slowly at night, helping to moderate temperature swings somewhat. Now, here is where we encounter the central problem of medieval peasant housing. These structures had no chimneys. The technology and construction techniques required to build a proper chimney were expensive and complex, representing an investment that was simply impossible for common folk. Yet fire was absolutely essential for survival. It provided heat, light, and the means to cook food. How then did medieval peasants solve this seemingly impossible problem? The solution was the central hearth, a fire pit placed in the middle of the single room, typically on the earthen floor or on a raised stone platform if the family could manage it. Here, a fire would be maintained throughout the winter, never fully extinguished, carefully banked at night and coaxed back to life each morning. The smoke from this fire had to escape somehow, and the method was brutally simple. It rose upward through the living space and eventually found its way out through holes in the roof, through the thatch itself, or through gaps left intentionally in the construction near the roof peak. Imagine, if you can, living continuously in a room filled with wood smoke. Your eyes would water constantly. Your throat would be perpetually irritated. Everything you owned, your clothes, your bedding, your food, would smell of smoke. The soot would coat the walls, the ceiling, your skin, your hair. When you coughed, which you would do often, you might expel black mucus. This was not a temporary inconvenience, but the permanent condition of life for millions of people throughout the medieval period. Yet this smoky environment was far preferable to the alternative, which was freezing to death. The smoke was a nuisance, yes, and probably contributed to respiratory problems that shortened lives and caused chronic discomfort, but the fire beneath it was life itself. It provided the warmth that made survival possible. It cooked the food that sustained the family. It gave light during the long darkness of winter nights. It was the literal and figurative heart of the home, and around it, all life revolved. The fire's placement in the centre of the room was not arbitrary but carefully considered. This position allowed the heat to radiate in all directions, warming the entire space more effectively than if the fire had been against a wall. It also meant that people could gather around it in a circle, with everyone having relatively equal access to warmth. During the coldest nights, the entire family might huddle as close to the fire as they dared, finding positions where they could absorb heat without being so close that they risked burns or igniting their clothing. But the fire alone was not sufficient to keep a medieval peasant dwelling warm through the depths of winter. The techniques for maintaining warmth extended far beyond simply burning wood. One of the most important strategies was one that might strike modern sensibilities as bizarre or even revolting: cohabitation with livestock. In many regions, particularly in colder climates, peasant dwellings were designed to accommodate animals as well as humans under the same roof. The structure might be divided, with humans occupying one end and livestock, cows, goats, pigs, sheep, housed at the other, separated by nothing more than a low partition, or sometimes sharing the same space entirely. The animals might be brought inside only during the worst weather, or they might live indoors throughout the winter months. This arrangement served multiple purposes. Most obviously, animals generate significant body heat. A cow, for instance, produces heat equivalent to several hundred watts continuously, simply through its metabolic processes. Multiple animals in an enclosed space could raise the ambient temperature noticeably, perhaps by several degrees, which sounds modest but represented a meaningful improvement in comfort and safety during a winter that might see temperatures inside an unheated dwelling approach freezing or even drop below it. Additionally, having animals under the same roof meant that they could be tended even during the worst storms, when venturing outside might be dangerous or impossible. It meant their body heat was not wasted warming an empty barn, but contributed to warming the human inhabitants. It meant that if animals died during the winter, which was common, the family would know immediately and could salvage the meat before it froze or spoiled. The disadvantages of this arrangement were obvious. Animals produce not just heat but also waste, and while some of this could be composted or removed periodically, the smell must have been intense. The animals made noise throughout the night, disturbing sleep. They required feeding from the same precious stores that sustained the human family. They brought in parasites, fleas, lice, ticks, which would inevitably spread to human inhabitants. But these drawbacks were accepted as reasonable trade-offs for the warmth and survival benefits the animals provided. The buildings themselves were designed to maximize heat retention with whatever resources were available. Windows, if they existed at all, were tiny, mere slits in the walls that might be closed with wooden shutters. Glass was a luxury far beyond the means of peasants, appearing only in churches and the homes of the wealthy. These tiny windows meant that peasant homes were dark even during the day, but they also meant less heat loss and better protection from wind. Doors were kept as small as possible for the same reason. Smaller openings meant less cold air could enter when someone passed through. The doors themselves might be made from thick wooden planks, and in the coldest regions, families might hang additional coverings over the doorway in winter, curtains made from wool or even animal hides, to create an extra barrier against drafts. The low ceilings common in peasant dwellings also served a purpose. Heat rises, so a low ceiling meant that less heat was lost in the empty space above head height. The entire interior volume of the dwelling was smaller, making it easier to heat the space and maintain whatever warmth could be generated. Some homes were built partially underground, with the floor level several feet below the surrounding grade, taking advantage of the Earth's natural insulation and the fact that temperature underground is more stable than above it. Every gap, every crack, every opening was a potential source of dangerous heat loss and had to be addressed. In autumn, before the worst cold arrived, families would inspect their dwellings carefully, looking for any place where wind might penetrate. These gaps would be sealed with whatever materials were available: mud, moss, cloth, straw, or even mixtures of clay and animal hair that could be pressed into cracks and would harden in place. Some families would construct windbreaks around their homes, piling brush or straw against the walls to provide an additional layer of insulation. In regions where snow was reliable, the first snowfall might actually be welcome because snow itself is an excellent insulator. Drifts that formed against the walls of a dwelling would help keep warmth inside, creating what was essentially a natural insulation barrier. Inside these dark, smoky, often crowded dwellings, medieval peasants developed routines and practices designed to conserve warmth. The fire was never allowed to go completely out if it could be helped, because rekindling a fire from scratch was difficult and time-consuming. Instead, at night, the fire would be banked, covered with ashes and turf so that it burned very slowly, producing just enough heat to prevent it from dying entirely. In the morning, this carefully preserved fire could be coaxed back to life by removing the covering and adding fresh fuel and gentle blowing to provide oxygen. The fuel itself was a constant concern. Wood was the primary heating fuel in most of medieval Europe, and enormous quantities of it were required to keep a fire burning throughout the winter months. Peasants who lived near forests might gather fallen branches and deadwood, a right sometimes granted by local lords though often restricted. In regions where wood was scarce, other materials might be burned. Peat, which is partially decomposed plant matter dug from bogs and dried, or even dried animal dung mixed with straw, which burned surprisingly well though with an unpleasant smell. The gathering and preparation of fuel occupied much of the autumn. Families would accumulate large piles of wood, ideally enough to last the entire winter, stored as close to the dwelling as possible so it could be accessed even during storms. The wood would be stacked in ways that allowed air circulation for drying, because wet wood burns poorly and produces more smoke. This fuel represented survival, and its consumption was carefully managed. There were nights when a family might debate whether to add another piece of wood to the fire or to huddle closer together under blankets and endure a colder night to make their stores last longer. The reality of peasant housing in medieval Europe was thus one of constant compromise, of accepting discomfort and even hardship as the price of survival. These dwellings were dark, smoky, crowded, often shared with animals, and never truly warm by any modern standard. Even close to the fire, the heat was intense on the side facing the flames while the back remained cold. Moving away from the fire meant entering zones of progressively greater cold, so that the far corners of the dwelling might be barely warmer than the outdoors. Yet within these limitations, medieval peasants created homes. They raised children who laughed and played even in these cramped conditions. They shared meals, told stories, sang songs, observed holy days and seasonal celebrations. The fire around which they gathered was not just a source of physical warmth, but a focal point for family and community, a place where knowledge was transmitted from old to young, where the day's events were discussed, where human connection flourished even in the midst of material hardship. The peasant dwelling, humble as it was, represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about how to shelter human life against winter's assault with the simplest possible means. It was a solution born of necessity, refined through countless generations, adapted to local conditions and available resources. It was not comfortable, not by any stretch of imagination, but it worked. It kept people alive through winters that would have killed them had they lacked even this basic shelter. And in that survival, in that stubborn persistence of life in the face of cold and darkness, there is something admirable, something that speaks to the resilience and ingenuity of our ancestors. Now, having explored how medieval peasants housed themselves against the winter, let us turn to how they actually slept, how they arranged their rest during those long, dark, cold nights when the very act of sleeping presented challenges we can barely imagine. In the modern world, sleep is something we do in relative privacy, in dedicated rooms, on sophisticated mattresses designed with materials engineered for comfort. We adjust our thermostats to maintain optimal sleeping temperature. We cocoon ourselves in bedding chosen for its warmth or coolness depending on the season. We take for granted that sleep will be comfortable, or at least that discomfort during sleep is an unusual occurrence worth complaining about. Medieval sleep was nothing like this. For the common people of the Middle Ages, sleep was something that happened in the same space where everything else happened, with minimal separation from the other activities and inhabitants of the household, in conditions that range from uncomfortable to genuinely miserable. Yet somehow sleep came anyway, because exhausted bodies demanded it. The beds of medieval peasants were, in most cases, about as simple as beds could possibly be. The most basic sleeping arrangement was literally a pile of straw spread on the floor. Fresh straw from the harvest would be gathered, perhaps mixed with dried grass or leaves, and formed into a loose pile or packed into a rough corner of the dwelling. A coarse cloth or wool blanket might be spread over this straw to create a slightly more comfortable surface, and then another cloth or blanket would cover the sleeper. This straw bedding had some advantages. Straw is naturally insulating, trapping air between the hollow stems, and a thick pile of it provided some cushioning and separation from the cold ground or floor. It was also readily available in agricultural communities and could be refreshed easily when it became compressed or contaminated. The downsides, however, were considerable. Straw is prickly, and even with cloth covering it, the sleeper would feel the sharp ends of the straw poking through. Straw harboured vermin, lice, fleas, and other parasites that would infest both the bedding and the people who slept in it. The straw would gradually break down and become dust, contributing to the already poor air quality in smoke-filled dwellings. Those who could afford slightly better bedding might have a straw mattress, which was essentially a large sack made of sturdy woven cloth and stuffed with straw. This contained the straw somewhat, making it less likely to scatter and easier to move. These mattresses might be placed on simple wooden bed frames if the family had one, raising the sleeper off the cold floor, or they might simply be laid on the floor and rolled up or stacked against a wall during the day to create more living space. The wealthier peasants and townspeople might have mattresses stuffed with materials beyond straw. Wool was one step up. A woolen mattress provided better cushioning and insulation, though it was heavy and would compress over time, requiring restuffing. In coastal areas or near moorlands, dried seaweed or heather might be used as stuffing material. The very best mattresses, affordable only to merchants and the minor nobility, might contain feathers or down plucked from geese or ducks, but such luxury was far beyond the reach of common folk. Regardless of the mattress, additional bedding was essential for winter survival. The primary covering was wool blankets, and here we must pause to appreciate the miracle that is wool. Wool is one of nature's remarkable materials for cold weather. The fibres naturally crimp and curl, creating millions of tiny air pockets that trap warmth. Wool absorbs moisture without feeling wet, meaning it continues to insulate even when damp from body moisture or ambient humidity. It's also naturally somewhat fire-resistant, an important quality when sleeping near an open fire. A family might have several wool blankets of varying weights and quality, accumulated over years and passed down through generations. These blankets would be used in layers, with the heaviest reserved for the coldest nights. Animal furs were even better insulators when available, particularly furs from animals like sheep, goats, or rabbits that could be obtained locally. Wealthier households might have furs from more exotic animals, bear, wolf, fox. But for most people, a sheepskin or goatskin was the height of luxury. But bedding alone was not sufficient to keep warm through a medieval winter night. The fire that had burned during the day would be carefully banked before sleep, reduced to glowing coals covered with ash to preserve them until morning. This meant the dwelling would gradually cool throughout the night, and even the best bedding could not fully compensate for the dropping temperature. The solution was perhaps the most important heat source of all: other people. Medieval sleeping arrangements were fundamentally communal. The concept of individual beds for each family member, which seems natural to us, would have struck medieval people as bizarre and wasteful. Beds were shared, not because people lacked space or resources for individual beds, but because sleeping together was the single most effective way to stay warm through the night. A typical peasant family might have one or two sleeping areas. Parents might share one bed or sleeping space, while children piled together in another. But piling together is not an exaggeration. Children would sleep 3, 4, or even more to a bed, pressed close together, sharing body heat through the long, cold night. Infants and toddlers would sleep between older children or parents, where they would be warmest and where adults could monitor them through the night. This communal sleeping served multiple purposes beyond warmth. It allowed parents to keep their children close and safe. It meant that if someone became ill during the night, others would notice. It fostered a kind of physical intimacy and family bonding that has largely vanished from modern life, where we value privacy and personal space above almost all other considerations. The practice extended beyond immediate family. In larger households, servants or hired labourers might sleep in the same room as the family, perhaps on simple pallets of straw laid on the floor. Travellers seeking shelter might be offered a space to sleep near the fire, or even, if they were of sufficient status, a place in the family's bed itself. This last practice strikes modern sensibilities as strange, but it was common throughout the medieval period and well into early modern times. We have records from medieval inns describing how travellers would commonly share beds with complete strangers, sometimes several people to a bed, because this was simply the normal way of sleeping. The shared warmth made it practical, and medieval concepts of privacy were very different from ours. Personal space was a luxury of the wealthy, not something ordinary people expected or even particularly desired. Clothing played a crucial role in nighttime warmth. The romantic image of medieval people sleeping naked is largely a myth, at least for common folk during winter. Some people might have had a dedicated sleeping garment, a long woolen shirt or shift, but many simply kept on the same layered clothing they had worn during the day, perhaps removing only the outermost, dirtiest layers. Keeping your clothes on served multiple purposes. It provided extra insulation. It meant you were somewhat protected from the vermin that infested bedding, and it meant you could respond more quickly if there was an emergency during the night. Nearly everyone wore some kind of head covering while sleeping. A great deal of body heat is lost through the head, and a wool cap or hood kept the head and ears warm. Women would braid their long hair before bed and tie it up or cover it with a cloth cap, both to keep it from tangling and to conserve warmth. The image of people sleeping with nightcaps is not a quaint historical curiosity, but a practical response to very real cold. For those who could afford them, there were additional methods to add warmth to the bed. Bed warmers were simple devices, typically a pan made of copper or brass with a hinged lid and a long wooden handle. Just before bed, hot coals from the fire would be placed in this pan, and it would be passed between the sheets to warm the bedding. The warmth wouldn't last the entire night, but it made the initial entry into bed far more bearable, and took the chill out of sheets that might otherwise feel almost frozen to the touch. Another technique was to heat stones in the fire, then wrap them in cloth and place them in the bed as heat sources. These retained warmth for hours, and multiple stones could be used to warm different parts of the bed. The practice required care. Stones heated too much could crack or even explode, and stones not wrapped adequately could burn skin. But when done properly, it could make sleep significantly more comfortable. Bed curtains, when they existed, were not merely decorative. In wealthier peasant homes or small merchants' dwellings, a bed might have fabric curtains hanging around it. These served to trap the sleeper's body heat within a smaller space, creating a warmer micro-environment within the larger cold room. They also provided some degree of privacy and blocked drafts. The bed thus became a small, relatively warm nest within the larger, colder dwelling. But even with all these measures, medieval sleep during winter was rarely truly comfortable. The cold was a constant presence. People would wake frequently through the night. The first sleep and second sleep pattern that was common in medieval times partly arose because sleeping through an entire night in such conditions was difficult. You might wake cold, Adjust your covers, huddle closer to your sleeping companions, perhaps add a piece of wood to the fire, then settle back to sleep for another few hours. The morning brought its own challenges. Rising from whatever warmth had been accumulated under the blankets to face the cold air of the dwelling required a kind of courage. The fire would need to be revived from its banked coals, fresh fuel added, warmth slowly rebuilt in the dwelling. Until the fire was burning well, everyone would remain in bed if possible, delaying the unpleasant transition from the relative warmth of the bedding to the chill of the waking world. For elderly people and infants, whose bodies were less able to regulate temperature, these sleeping conditions were genuinely dangerous. Many elderly people died during their sleep on particularly cold nights, their bodies simply unable to maintain core temperature under such harsh conditions. Infant mortality was horrendous in the medieval period for many reasons, but cold was certainly a contributing factor. Infants were kept close to their mothers, benefiting from adult body heat, but even this was sometimes insufficient during the worst cold. The sleeping arrangements of medieval common folk were thus a complex system of strategies and compromises, combining bedding materials, clothing, shared body warmth, and careful fire management. They were far from comfortable by any modern standard, but they represent sophisticated adaptation to difficult circumstances using only the simplest available resources. And yet, somehow, sleep came. Exhausted from the day's labour, lulled by the sounds of the fire and the breathing of family members, warmed by shared body heat under piles of wool and fur, medieval people found rest. They dreamed, they woke, they drifted back to sleep. They endured the long cold nights and rose again each morning to face another winter day. Their sleep may not have been peaceful or comfortable, but it sustained them, and in the end that was sufficient. Now let us shift our attention from the peasant cottage to the castle, from the humblest dwellings to the mightiest, and explore a curious paradox, that those who lived in the grandest buildings of the medieval world often faced unique challenges in staying warm, challenges that arose from the very strength and permanence of their stone walls. The medieval castle is one of the most iconic images of the Middle Ages. Towering walls, narrow windows, grand halls with soaring ceilings, an architecture of power and defence. These structures were designed primarily for military purposes, to withstand siege and assault, to project lordly authority across the landscape. Comfort was always secondary to these functions, and in winter this meant that castles could be spectacularly cold places to live. The fundamental problem was one of material and scale. Castle walls were massively thick, built of stone or heavy masonry, precisely the features that made them defensible. Stone is an excellent building material for durability, but it has serious drawbacks for winter comfort. Stone absorbs cold and releases it slowly, meaning that castle walls effectively became reservoirs of cold that radiated chill into the interior spaces. On a bitter winter day, the interior surface of a castle wall might be only marginally warmer than the outdoor air, and touching such a wall with bare skin was unpleasant in the extreme. The great halls that formed the centre of castle life presented particular heating challenges. These were enormous spaces, often 50 to 80 feet long or more, with ceilings that soared 20 or 30 feet high. The purpose of such scale was partly practical. The hall needed to accommodate the entire household, which might include dozens or even hundreds of people, and partly symbolic, meant to impress visitors with the Lord's power and wealth. But all that volume had to be heated somehow, and the heating technologies available in the medieval period were simply not up to the task. The earliest castles relied on central hearths in their great halls, similar to peasant dwellings but on a much grander scale. A large fire pit would be constructed in the centre of the hall, and an enormous fire kept burning there. The smoke rose toward the ceiling and eventually found its way out through gaps in the roof, through louvers, or through deliberately constructed openings. Some halls had elaborate wooden structures in the ceiling designed to help direct smoke toward these exits, but the hall would still be smoky and heat distribution was poor. Those standing closest to the fire might be uncomfortably warm, even at risk of their clothing catching fire, while people at the edges of the hall shivered in the cold. The great innovation that eventually improved castle heating was the fireplace with a chimney, a technology that began to appear in the 12th century, but only became common by the 13th. These fireplaces were built into the walls of the castle, with stone chimneys carrying smoke upward and out of the building. This was a massive improvement in terms of smoke, making interior spaces far more breathable, but ironically, it was less efficient at heating than the central hearth had been. A central hearth radiates heat in all directions, warming everyone around it. A fireplace built into a wall radiates heat primarily into the room, but much of the heat goes up the chimney along with the smoke. Medieval people recognized this inefficiency. They were not foolish, but accepted it as the trade-off for being able to breathe. Moreover, a fireplace could be larger than a central hearth, and the massive fireplaces found in castle halls, some large enough to roast an ox whole, at least provided spectacular quantities of heat, even if much of it was wasted. We can still see examples of these grand fireplaces in surviving medieval castles. At places like Rochester Castle in England, enormous fireplaces dominate the walls of the great halls, their openings 6 or 8 feet wide, with elaborate stone decoration that speaks to their importance. When a fire roared in these hearths, burning logs 6 feet long or more, the heat would have been intense for those sitting directly in front, and the dancing flames would have provided impressive illumination. But here's the critical point. Even with these grand fireplaces, castles were cold. The massive stone walls radiated chill. The high ceilings meant that heat rose far above head height, warming empty space rather than people. The small windows necessary for defense meant that even during the day, castles were dark and benefited little from whatever warmth the sun might provide. The stone floors were perpetually cold underfoot. Drafts were constant, as wind found its way through every imperfect seal, every arrow slit, every gap around ill-fitting doors. Medieval people took various measures to make castles more livable in winter. One of the most important was the use of fabric hangings, large pieces of woven wool or later silk that were hung across the walls. These hangings served multiple purposes. They provided visual warmth, adding colour and decoration to otherwise stark stone spaces. They displayed wealth and status through their quality and the scenes depicted on them. But most practically, they created an air gap between the cold stone wall and the interior space, providing a layer of insulation that helped keep warmth in the room. Some castles used enormous quantities of these hangings. The walls of the great hall might be completely covered, and additional curtains might be hung to subdivide the space, creating smaller, more easily heated zones within the larger hall. The grandest examples were the elaborate woven hangings that we now call tapestries, but simpler painted cloth served the same insulating purpose at less expense. The floors of castles were often covered with rushes or herbs, strewn thickly to provide some insulation from the cold stone. These would be refreshed periodically, with old rushes swept up and new ones laid down. In wealthier castles, actual carpets or rugs might cover the floor, both for comfort and to reduce heat loss through the floor. Even so, cold rose through the floor constantly, and medieval people learned to keep their feet covered at all times when indoors. As castle design evolved, spaces became more specialized and better adapted to winter living. By the late medieval period, castles typically had not just the great hall, but also private chambers for the lord and lady, smaller rooms that could be heated more effectively. These chambers would have their own fireplaces, much smaller than those in the great hall, but adequate for warming a more intimate space. The bed in these chambers would be enclosed with heavy curtains, creating almost a room within a room, a small space that could be kept relatively warm through body heat alone. Monasteries, which shared many architectural features with castles, developed their own solutions to winter cold. Many monasteries had a dedicated warming room, sometimes called a calefactory, which was the one room where a fire was kept burning throughout the winter. Monks were expected to endure cold as a form of mortification of the flesh, sleeping in unheated dormitories and attending services in unheated chapels. But even austere monastic rules recognized that some warmth was necessary for survival. The warming room at Revoll Abbey in England, for instance, had enormous fireplaces that were kept lit from November to Easter, and monks could go there to warm themselves for short periods between their other duties. This monastic approach highlights an important aspect of medieval attitudes toward cold. It was often seen as something virtuous to endure, a form of suffering that built spiritual character. Comfort was suspect, an indulgence of the flesh that distracted from spiritual concerns. This attitude influenced castle design and living patterns as well. The truly devout might deliberately choose not to heat certain spaces, accepting cold as a form of penance or discipline. But regardless of religious attitudes, the practical reality was that everyone, from the highest lord to the lowest servant, dealt with cold in a medieval castle. The difference was primarily one of degree. The lord might sleep in a chamber with a fireplace and a bed with heavy curtains, wearing fine wool nightclothes. The servant might sleep in a common dormitory with only a shared brazier for warmth, or in the hall itself curled up on a bench near the dying fire wrapped in a thin blanket. Servants often had it better than we might imagine in one respect. They slept in numbers. A dozen servants sleeping in the same room generated substantial collective body heat, and as with peasant families, this communal warmth was essential for survival. The hall itself was a popular sleeping spot for servants, because even after the grand fire had died down to coals, the stones around the hearth retained warmth for hours, slowly releasing it through the night. The kitchen of a castle was invariably one of the warmest spaces. Large fires burned there throughout the day for cooking, and the kitchen workers, who occupied a lower rung of the household hierarchy, at least had the benefit of constant warmth while they worked. Some castle kitchens were separate buildings to reduce fire risk, but when they were incorporated into the main structure, the rooms above them benefited from rising heat. Castle windows presented a particular challenge. The narrow arrow slits and small openings used for defense let in little light and were insufficient for effective ventilation, yet they still allowed drafts. In later medieval periods, as glass making improved, Some castle windows began to incorporate glass panes, usually in the form of small round pieces of glass held together with lead strips. These let in light while blocking wind, a tremendous improvement, but glass was expensive and fragile, and many castle windows remained open or covered only with wooden shutters well into the early modern period. One might think that castles, as residences of the wealthy, would have been significantly warmer than peasant cottages, but this was not necessarily the case. A peasant cottage, for all its smoke and crowding, was a small space that could be heated relatively effectively with one fire. A castle great hall was a vast space that might require multiple large fires burning constantly and still remain uncomfortably cold. The thick stone walls that provided security also provided exceptional thermal mass, which in winter meant they became massive heat sinks that had to be warmed before the interior would feel comfortable, a nearly impossible task. Moreover, castles were not static environments but busy places with people constantly moving about, opening and closing doors, letting in cold air with each passage. The castle was a working community, and work had to continue even in winter. The kitchen had to prepare food, the guards had to man their posts, the household had to function, and this constant activity made it impossible to seal up spaces against the cold the way a peasant family might hunker down in their cottage. The social dynamics of castle life also affected winter experience. The great hall was where the household gathered not just for warmth, but for meals, for entertainment, for conducting business. The lord was expected to maintain hospitality, to welcome travellers, to feed his household, to provide a centre of social life even in the depths of winter. This meant that the hall had to be functional, had to be warm enough, or at least not so cold as to be unbearable, for these activities to occur. During the coldest weather, the entire household might cluster in the hall, which became almost a village unto itself. People would eat there, work at tasks that could be done indoors, entertain themselves with music or stories, and sleep there as well. The gradations of social rank would be maintained, the lord and lady at the high table near the best fireplace, lesser folk farther away, but everyone would be in the same space, sharing the limited warmth available. Children growing up in castles faced their own challenges with cold. The children of the nobility were often sent to other noble households as pages or ladies in waiting, part of their education and training. These young people lived in conditions only somewhat better than servants, sleeping in dormitories, wearing heavy clothing indoors, enduring the same general cold as everyone else despite their noble birth. It was considered character building, a way to toughen them for adult life. The reality of castle life in winter, then, was one of constant compromise between the demands of defence, status, and comfort. Castles were impressive displays of power, and they could indeed protect their inhabitants from attack. But they could not effectively protect them from cold. The stone walls that defied siege engines could not defy winter's penetrating chill. The vast halls that displayed lordly magnificence were impossible to heat adequately. The narrow windows that prevented enemy entry also prevented the entry of warming sunlight. Medieval people accepted this situation because they had no alternative. Castles were not primarily designed for comfort, and those who lived in them understood that winter would bring hardship even to the wealthy and powerful. They adapted as best they could with the technology and understanding available to them, using fires and fabric hangings and clothing and all the other strategies we have discussed. They endured, as their peasant contemporaries endured, because endurance was simply what winter demanded. Now, having explored both humble cottage and grand castle, let us turn our attention to perhaps the single most important survival technology medieval people possessed, the clothing they wore, and particularly the miracle fibre that made winter survival possible: wool. In our modern world, we have an array of synthetic fabrics engineered for specific purposes. We have down insulation that packs light and traps warmth efficiently. We have moisture-wicking fabrics that pull sweat away from the skin. We have Gore-Tex and Thinsulate and dozens of other proprietary materials designed by teams of scientists to provide maximum warmth with minimum weight. Medieval people had none of this, but they had wool, and wool turned out to be remarkably well suited to the challenge of surviving a cold winter. Wool is the hair of sheep, and it possesses several properties that make it an ideal cold weather material. The individual wool fibres are crimped and naturally wavy, which means they trap air between them. This trapped air is what provides insulation. Air itself is a poor conductor of heat, so creating millions of tiny air pockets around the body is an excellent way to retain warmth. The more wool you wear, the more air you trap, the warmer you stay. But wool's advantages go beyond simple insulation. Wool fibres can absorb substantial moisture, up to 30% of their weight, without feeling wet to the touch. This is crucial because the human body produces moisture constantly through sweat and respiration, and in cold weather, this moisture can make you dangerously cold if it saturates your clothing. Wet cotton, for instance, loses most of its insulating value and can actually draw heat away from the body. Wet wool continues to insulate, meaning that even if you sweat or get caught in rain or snow, your wool clothing continues to protect you. Additionally, wool is naturally somewhat water repellent on the outside. The lanolin that coats wool fibres helps shed water, particularly if the wool has not been heavily washed to remove this natural oil. A wool cloak could protect a medieval traveller from rain quite effectively, especially if the wool was thick and tightly woven. Wool was also widely available throughout medieval Europe. Sheep farming was a major economic activity, particularly in regions like England, where wool became the foundation of substantial wealth. Even modest peasant families typically owned a few sheep, or could obtain wool through trade or barter. Women spent enormous amounts of time processing wool, cleaning it, carding it to align the fibres, spinning it into yarn, and weaving or knitting it into cloth. This was not occasional work, but a constant occupation throughout the year, because wool clothing wore out and had to be replaced, and a family needed substantial quantities of wool fabric to clothe all its members adequately. Medieval people understood layering instinctively. They did not have a modern understanding of thermodynamics, but they knew from experience that wearing multiple layers of clothing was warmer than wearing a single thick layer. The basic medieval outfit for a man might consist of a linen undershirt called a braise, worn directly against the skin. Over this would go a woolen tunic or shirt, and over that another layer of wool, perhaps a heavier tunic or a surcoat. On top of everything would be a cloak, a large piece of heavy wool that wrapped around the entire body and could be drawn up over the head as a hood. Women wore similar layers, though the specific garments differed. A linen shift would be worn against the skin, then a wool underdress, then an overdress, with a cloak or mantle on top. As the weather grew colder, additional layers would be added. There was no shame in wearing multiple tunics or gowns. In fact, this was expected and practical. The legs and feet required special attention because cold rising from the ground was a constant problem. Men wore wool hose, which were essentially thick wool stockings that might reach all the way to the waist or might stop at the knee, attached to the braes with ties. Shoes were made of leather, which provided some insulation, though leather becomes stiff and uncomfortable in extreme cold. Some people stuffed their shoes with straw or wool scraps to add insulation and improve fit. In the coldest weather, people might wear multiple pairs of hose or wrap their legs with additional wool strips. The head and hands were particularly vulnerable to cold, and medieval people protected them carefully. Wool caps were universal in winter, often with flaps that could cover the ears. Hoods were even more common, sometimes integrated into cloaks, sometimes separate garments. A wool hood that fit snugly around the face and could be drawn closed left only a small opening for the eyes and mouth, providing excellent protection against wind and cold. Mittens were more common than gloves because they were warmer. Keeping the fingers together allowed them to share warmth. These mittens would be made of heavy wool, sometimes lined with fur if available. For work requiring manual dexterity, people might wear fingerless mittens, which provided some warmth while leaving the fingertips exposed for delicate tasks, accepting the discomfort of cold fingers as necessary to get work done. Leather played an important role as an outer layer, particularly for protection against wind and moisture. A leather tunic worn over wool provided an additional windbreak. Leather shoes, leather gloves, leather hoods, all of these added protection. Leather required different preparation than wool. Animal hides had to be tanned, a complex and unpleasant process. But the result was a durable, relatively waterproof material that complemented wool effectively. For those who could afford it, fur provided the ultimate in warmth. Fur has many of the same properties as wool, but is even more effective at trapping air and providing insulation. A cloak lined with fur was a luxury item, but even common folk might have access to simpler furs. Sheepskin with the wool still attached could be worn with the wool side against the body for maximum warmth. Rabbit fur, though not as durable as other furs, was relatively easy to obtain through trapping, and rabbit fur mittens or hat linings provided excellent warmth. The clothing was worn essentially continuously through the winter. Medieval people did not change clothes daily as we do. A set of clothing might be worn for days or even weeks, removed only for major washing sessions or when it absolutely needed repair. This might seem unhygienic by modern standards, but it made practical sense. Removing clothing meant exposing yourself to cold, and in any case medieval standards of cleanliness were different from ours. The linen undergarments were changed and washed more frequently because linen can be boiled clean, but the wool outer layers were not washed often. Wool is easily damaged by washing, and in any case, how would you dry heavy wool clothing in the middle of winter? Nighttime clothing has already been touched upon, but it bears emphasis that medieval people often slept in the same layers they had worn during the day, perhaps removing only the outermost layer if it was particularly dirty or wet. Some people had dedicated sleeping garments, a wool nightshirt or a long woolen robe, but many simply kept their regular clothes on, recognizing that staying warm was more important than the modern notion of changing into sleepwear. Children's clothing followed the same patterns as adult clothing, but created particular challenges because children outgrow clothes quickly. Garments would be made deliberately large so that a child could grow into them. Clothing was passed down from older siblings to younger ones, mended and repaired repeatedly. A wool tunic might serve several children over multiple years before finally wearing out completely. Nothing was wasted. Even worn-out clothing would be cut up, and the good portions used for patches or smaller items like mittens or caps. The very poor faced additional challenges. Wool clothing was valuable, and those at the bottom of the social hierarchy might not have sufficient wool garments to stay adequately warm. They might have to make do with fewer layers, with clothing that was worn thin, with inadequate shoes or no shoes at all. For such people, winter was not just uncomfortable, but genuinely life-threatening, and every winter brought deaths among the poor who simply lacked sufficient clothing to survive the cold. The clothing also had to be maintained constantly. Wool attracts moths, which would eat holes in garments if not kept at bay. Clothes had to be aired regularly, shaken out, checked for damage. Mending was a constant task. Someone in the household, usually women, would spend hours darning holes, reattaching seams, replacing worn-out sections. Leather had to be treated with animal fat to keep it supple and waterproof. All of this maintenance was necessary because clothing represented a major investment of time and resources, and its failure could mean death. We should note that the widespread use of wool throughout medieval Europe had significant environmental impacts. The enormous flocks of sheep required to supply everyone with wool clothing meant that vast areas of land were devoted to pasture. In some regions, sheep farming became so dominant that it displaced other forms of agriculture and even led to the enclosure of common lands, sparking social conflict. The wealth generated by wool trade created powerful merchant classes and funded cathedrals and civic buildings. Wool was not just a material, but an economic force that shaped medieval society. The strategies we have been exploring, fire and bedding, housing and clothing, must all be understood as parts of an integrated system of winter survival. None of these elements alone was sufficient. Medieval people needed adequate shelter and sufficient fuel and appropriate bedding and proper clothing, all working together to create conditions that allowed survival. Remove any one element and the system could fail catastrophically. But beyond these physical elements, winter survival also required careful food management, and this brings us to perhaps the most anxiety-inducing aspect of medieval winter. The constant awareness that you were consuming stored food that had to last until spring, and if you had miscalculated, or if the winter ran longer than expected, or if your stores were damaged, starvation loomed as a very real possibility. The medieval year was divided sharply between the growing season, when food was abundant, and winter, when almost nothing grew, and all food had to come from stores accumulated during the warmer months. This meant that the entire rhythm of medieval life was oriented around this cycle of abundance and scarcity. Summer and fall were seasons of frantic activity, of harvesting and preserving, of slaughtering animals whose meat would be preserved, of drying and smoking and salting and storing against the lean times ahead. The primary staple food for most medieval Europeans was grain: wheat, rye, barley, oats, depending on the region. These grains would be harvested in late summer or early fall and stored as whole grain, which kept better than flour. The grain would be ground into flour as needed throughout the winter. A family would need enormous quantities of grain to survive, hundreds of pounds per person, and storing it safely was a major challenge. Grain had to be kept dry, protected from rodents and insects, stored in a way that allowed air circulation to prevent mold. Wealthy households and monasteries had dedicated granaries, but peasant families stored grain wherever they could, often in large sacks or barrels in the driest part of their dwelling. Vegetables that could survive storage were also crucial. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, beets, parsnips, could be stored in pits dug into the ground and lined with straw, where the cool, humid conditions kept them from freezing or drying out. Onions and garlic could be braided and hung in dry places. Cabbage could be fermented into sauerkraut, a process that preserved it and actually enhanced its nutritional value. Beans and peas were dried and could be stored for months, providing valuable protein during winter. Meat was more challenging to preserve, but various methods were employed. The most important was salting. Meat would be cut into pieces, layered with salt and packed in barrels. The salt drew out moisture and created an environment hostile to bacteria, allowing the meat to keep for months. Salted pork was a staple, because pigs were easy to raise and provided plenty of fat along with meat. Smoked meat was another option, hung in the rafters of dwellings where it absorbed smoke from the fire, which both flavoured it and helped preserve it. Dried meat, cut into thin strips and air-dried, was less common in damp climates, but could work in drier regions. Fish was preserved using similar methods, dried, salted, or smoked. In coastal regions and near large rivers, fish was a crucial winter food source. Herring, cod, and other fish were caught in enormous quantities during fishing season and then preserved for winter consumption. The Catholic Church's requirement that the faithful abstain from meat on Fridays and during Lent meant that fish was particularly important, ensuring a steady demand for preserved fish. Dairy products provided another winter food source where available. Milk could not be preserved fresh, but it could be made into cheese, which keeps for extended periods. Hard cheeses, aged over months, could last through the winter and provided valuable protein and fat. Butter could be preserved by salting or by storing it in peat bogs, where the cool, acidic conditions kept it from spoiling. Every family had to calculate how much food they would need to survive the winter, and then acquire or produce that much during the growing season. This calculation had to account for every member of the household, including children who would grow and need more food as winter progressed, as well as any animals that would be kept alive through the winter, rather than slaughtered in the fall. The margin for error was small. Overestimate and you would waste effort accumulating more than needed, but underestimate and you might starve before spring. The winter diet was thus monotonous and increasingly sparse as the season progressed. A typical meal might consist of a thick porridge or stew called pottage, made from grains and whatever vegetables were available, perhaps flavoured with a bit of preserved meat or cheese if the family was doing well. This same pottage might be eaten for days on end, reheated repeatedly, with new ingredients added as needed. Bread was a staple when grain was available for baking, though in the depths of winter, families might eat more gruel and porridge to conserve fuel needed for bread making. As winter progressed and stores diminished, the quality and quantity of food would decline. Grain supplies would be carefully rationed. The best preserved vegetables would be eaten first, while the ones showing signs of rot had to be used quickly or discarded. Any sign of trouble, grain that smelled musty, meat that seemed questionable, cheese that showed suspicious mold, created anxiety because every bit of food mattered. Fuel management was equally crucial because cooking required fire, and fire required fuel, and fuel supplies were finite. Every piece of wood burned for cooking was wood that could not be used for heating, and families had to balance these competing needs constantly. Some foods were chosen specifically because they required minimal cooking. Porridge could simmer with very little fuel compared to baking bread or roasting meat. The one-pot meal became standard because it made efficient use of fire. The fire itself was never merely about staying warm, it was also the means of food preparation. The central hearth in a peasant dwelling, or the great fireplace in a castle hall, would have a pot hanging over it, suspended from a hook or chain. This pot might contain the day's pottage, kept warm all day, and added to as needed. In wealthier households, the kitchen would have multiple fires and more sophisticated cooking equipment, but the basic principle was the same. Fire provided warmth and the means to cook food simultaneously. Water was another winter concern. In the depths of winter, all available water might freeze, meaning that snow or ice had to be melted for drinking and cooking. This required fuel and time, but it was absolutely necessary. Dehydration was as dangerous as cold or hunger, and medieval people had to ensure adequate water intake, even when obtaining water required breaking through ice or melting snow. The psychological burden of watching food stores decline through the winter must have been enormous. Every meal consumed was food that would not be available later. Every piece of bread eaten moved the family one step closer to the moment when the stores would be exhausted, and if winter lingered longer than expected, if spring planting was delayed by late snows, the period between the exhaustion of stored food and the first new harvest could become a time of genuine starvation, a period historians call the Hunger Gap, that claimed many lives throughout the medieval period. Medieval people developed various strategies to cope with this anxiety. They maintained careful inventories of their stores, checking regularly on the condition of stored food. They rationed carefully, particularly as winter progressed and it became clear how much remained versus how much longer winter might last. They helped each other, sharing food within communities when some families had more and others less, understanding that survival often depended on cooperation rather than strict individual self-sufficiency. Religious institutions played a role in winter food security. Monasteries often maintained larger stores than individual families and were expected to provide charity to the poor. Some monasteries distributed food regularly during winter, and while the amounts might be small, they could make the difference between survival and starvation for the most desperate. Churches collected tithes during the harvest season and redistributed some of this during winter, particularly to widows, orphans, and others who could not provide for themselves. But even with these support systems, winter hunger was common. Most people lost weight during winter, living on reduced rations compared to the abundance of harvest time. Children's growth might slow during winter months. The elderly, whose appetites might already be reduced, often received smaller portions to ensure that those working and children growing had adequate food. This was not cruelty, but practical calculation about who most needed nutrition to survive. The first signs of spring were thus greeted with enormous relief, but also with caution because the stored food was at its lowest just when spring arrived. The very early spring vegetables, the first wild greens that could be foraged, the first shoots of cultivated plants, were eagerly consumed even though they provided minimal nutrition, because they represented fresh food and they promised that winter's grip was finally loosening. Understanding medieval food management helps us appreciate how precarious winter survival was. It was not just a matter of staying physically warm, but also of maintaining adequate nutrition through months when no fresh food was available, and stored food constantly declined in quantity and quality. The winter season tested not just the body's ability to endure cold, but the community's foresight in storing adequate supplies and its discipline in consuming those supplies at a rate that would allow everyone to survive until spring. Now, having explored the many practical aspects of medieval winter survival, shelter and sleeping arrangements, clothing and food management, we should turn our attention to another dimension of the winter experience: the psychological and spiritual challenges of enduring months of cold, darkness, and privation. Medieval winter was not just physically challenging, but psychologically oppressive. The darkness alone was difficult in ways we struggle to understand. We live in a world illuminated at will. We flip a switch and light floods our spaces. We can read comfortably at any hour, work through the night if needed, move about our homes with ease regardless of whether the sun shines. Medieval people had none of this. Artificial light came from candles or oil lamps, both of which were expensive and provided only feeble illumination compared to the sun or modern electric lights. Tallow candles made from animal fat were the cheapest option, but burned with a smoky, unpleasant smell and gave off dim, flickering light. Beeswax candles were far superior, brighter, cleaner burning, pleasant smelling, but also expensive, reserved for churches and the wealthy. Oil lamps burned fish oil, vegetable oil, or whale oil, depending on availability, providing light roughly equivalent to a candle, but requiring more equipment and maintenance. Most peasant families could not afford to burn candles or lamps extensively. These precious sources of light were reserved for essential tasks that could not be done by daylight or by firelight. The fire itself was the primary light source, and while a good fire provided adequate illumination for the area immediately around it, it left the rest of the dwelling in deep shadow. As night fell, which in midwinter might be as early as 4 in the afternoon in northern regions, darkness descended not for a few hours but for 15 or more, a vast stretch of time during which little could be accomplished beyond huddling near the fire and waiting for sleep to come. The darkness was not empty but filled with sounds, the wind howling around the dwelling, making walls creak and thatch rustle, the sounds of animals, whether livestock sharing the dwelling or wild creatures outside, the breathing of family members sleeping nearby, the pop and crackle of the fire. In this darkness, the imagination conjured threats. Medieval people believed in demons, in evil spirits that walked at night, in supernatural dangers that lurked in darkness. These beliefs were not mere superstition, but deeply held convictions that shaped behavior and created genuine fear. Prayer was the primary defense against night fears. Before sleeping, families would pray together, invoking divine protection through the night. The words, "If I should die before I wake," were not a mere formality, but reflected a real understanding that night was dangerous, that morning's arrival was not guaranteed. The darkness held not just imagined spiritual threats, but real physical dangers. Fires could spread, thieves might break in, wild animals might attack livestock, illness could strike suddenly in the night. The long winter nights also brought boredom, a challenge that might seem trivial compared to cold and hunger, but was nonetheless significant. With little light for work or reading, with no entertainment technologies, With everyone confined to small spaces by the weather, how did medieval people occupy themselves through the endless hours of winter darkness? Storytelling was one crucial answer. Oral tradition was strong throughout the medieval period, with tales passed down through generations, stories of saints and heroes, of local history and legend, of cautionary fables and comic anecdotes. An elder family member or a visitor might regale the household with tales, with everyone gathered around the fire listening in the dancing light. These stories entertained but also educated, transmitting values and practical knowledge, reinforcing community identity and religious faith. Music provided another diversion. Even peasant families might have simple instruments, a drum, a flute, a stringed instrument. Songs were passed down orally, and winter evenings might include singing, with everyone joining in familiar melodies. The very act of making music together created connection, fostered community, and made the dark hours pass more quickly. Simple games played an important role. Dice games, though condemned by some religious authorities as gambling, were nonetheless common. Board games existed, though expensive enough that only wealthier households had them. Children played simpler games that required no equipment, verbal games, memory games, physical games that could be played in a limited space. Adults might engage in riddles or word play, contests of wit and knowledge that provided mental stimulation during the long idle hours. Handwork occupied those with adequate light. Women might spin wool or sew by firelight, tasks that could be done with minimal illumination and whose endless repetition was actually soothing. Men might whittle or work on simple crafts, repairing tools or making items needed by the household. This work was not just productive but psychologically valuable, giving purpose to otherwise empty hours. Religious observance structured time during winter darkness. The canonical hours, times set aside for prayer throughout the day and night, were observed not just in monasteries but to varying degrees in secular households as well. These regular prayer times broke up the long stretches of darkness and inactivity, providing rhythm and meaning to each day. Sundays and holy days offered particular occasions for communal gathering, for attending church services, for social interaction that relieved the isolation of winter. But even with all these strategies, depression and what we might now call seasonal affective disorder must have been common. The combination of reduced sunlight, cold, physical discomfort, limited diet, and social isolation created conditions that modern psychology recognizes as conducive to depression. Medieval people had no name for this phenomenon and no psychological framework to understand it, but they experienced it nonetheless. Winter gloom, melancholy, listlessness. These were recognized as part of winter's burden, to be endured like the cold itself. The communal nature of medieval life probably provided some protection against the worst psychological effects of winter. Peasant families lived in close quarters, constantly surrounded by others. Castle households were busy communities where isolation was nearly impossible. This meant that someone struggling with winter depression was unlikely to be alone with their suffering. Others would notice, would offer companionship, would provide the human connection that could alleviate some of the burden. Religious faith also provided psychological resources for dealing with winter hardship. The belief that suffering had spiritual value, that endurance built character and earned divine favor, gave meaning to winter privations. The anticipation of Christmas, occurring near the winter solstice and thus at the darkest point of the year, provided something to look forward to, a celebration that broke up winter's monotony. The gradual return of the light after the solstice was noted and celebrated, a sign that winter would not last forever. Communities developed traditions around winter that served to maintain morale. Despite the scarcity of resources, winter festivals occurred, times when stored food was used for feasting rather than merely subsisting, when people gathered for celebration despite the cold. These festivals were not frivolous wastes of precious resources, but crucial for maintaining the psychological resilience needed to endure winter's full duration. A community that could still celebrate, still come together in joy despite hardship, was a community that would survive. The anticipation of spring was itself a psychological tool. Medieval people marked the progression towards spring carefully, noting each small sign, the slight lengthening of days, the first birds returning from migration, the subtle changes in weather patterns. These signs provided hope, reminding everyone that winter was not permanent, that warmth and abundance would return. The early spring celebrations, various folk traditions, and later the Christian observance of Easter, marked winter's end with joy that reflected genuine relief at having survived. We should also consider the psychological impact on those who did not survive winter, or rather on those who survived but lost family members, neighbours, friends. Winter mortality was highest among the very young, the very old, and those already weakened by poverty or illness. Every spring brought not just relief but also grief, as communities counted their dead and mourned those who had not survived winter's test. This grief was a regular part of medieval life, accepted but not any less painful for its predictability. Children growing up in medieval Europe learned from early age that winter was serious, that survival required preparation and discipline, that comfort could not be taken for granted. They learned to tolerate cold, to work despite discomfort, to accept privation as a normal part of life's rhythm. This education in hardship created adults who were psychologically prepared for difficulty, who did not expect life to be easy, who possessed a kind of toughness that modern people, cushioned by technological comfort, rarely develop. Yet medieval people were not grim, joyless stoics simply enduring one winter after another. The evidence we have, from poems and songs, from marginalia in manuscripts, from archaeological evidence of feast remains and gaming pieces, suggest that joy and laughter, play and celebration were also part of winter experience. People found moments of happiness even in difficult circumstances. They valued family connection, friendship, community. They found beauty in a well-made garment, satisfaction in a warm fire, pleasure in a good meal even if the meal was simple. Winter hardship made them appreciate small comforts more intensely than we, who take comfort for granted, typically can. The psychological dimension of medieval winter survival reminds us that humans are not merely physical beings who require warmth and food, but social and spiritual creatures who require meaning, connection, hope. Medieval people survived winter not just through the practical strategies we have been exploring, but through psychological and spiritual resources that enabled them to endure months of hardship without losing their humanity, without giving up, without descending into despair. They maintained communities, raised children, pursued crafts and arts, practiced their faith, looked after each other. They remained fully human despite conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. As we move toward the conclusion of our exploration, we should consider how these medieval winter survival strategies varied across different regions of Europe, because the specific challenges and solutions differed considerably depending on geography, climate, and local traditions. Medieval Europe was not uniform but a patchwork of different climates and cultures, each developing its own particular wisdom about how to survive winter. In Scandinavia, winter brought extremes of cold and darkness that surpassed what more southern Europeans experienced. The winter nights in northern regions could last 20 hours or more, with the sun barely clearing the horizon during the middle of the day. Temperatures dropped to levels that could kill exposed flesh within minutes. Yet people lived in these regions, developed thriving communities, survived and even prospered despite the harsh climate. Scandinavian building techniques reflected these extreme conditions. Houses were built more substantially than in milder climates, with heavier timber construction and more attention to insulation. Some dwellings were built partially underground, taking advantage of the Earth's stable temperature and protection from wind. Roofs were often covered with turf, providing excellent insulation. The longhouse design, which accommodated both humans and animals under one roof with a central hearth, maximized heat conservation and made efficient use of all available warmth. Scandinavian clothing traditions emphasized fur and leather more than in regions where wool alone was adequate. The need for truly waterproof, windproof outer layers in the face of Arctic conditions made fur essential, and Scandinavian hunters and traders developed sophisticated techniques for working with fur and leather. Multiple layers were standard, with particular attention to protecting extremities, hands, feet, face, which were most vulnerable to frostbite. Food preservation techniques in Scandinavia adapted to the extreme cold, which actually helped preserve food. Meat could be frozen solid and would remain preserved as long as temperatures stayed below freezing, eliminating some of the need for salting or smoking. Fish could be dried in the cold, dry air, producing the stockfish that became a major trade commodity. The climate was harsh but predictable, and Scandinavian communities developed reliable routines for winter survival that worked despite the severity of their environment. In the British Isles, the challenge was less extreme cold than dampness and wind. Britain's maritime climate meant that temperatures rarely dropped as low as in continental Europe, but the constant moisture made the cold feel more penetrating. Heating a damp house was difficult because so much energy went into evaporating moisture rather than raising temperature. British buildings developed features to address this: better drainage around foundations, higher stone plinths to keep timber framing above ground moisture, steeper roof pitches to shed rain more effectively. British wool was famous throughout medieval Europe for its quality, and the British took advantage of this local resource by producing excellent woolen cloth. The heavy, tightly woven wool fabrics produced in Britain provided excellent protection against their damp climate. British clothing traditions emphasized layered wool with water-resistant outer layers made from oiled or carefully worked wool that shed water. The Mediterranean regions faced milder winters, but were in some ways less prepared for cold, because architecture and clothing traditions were oriented toward heat rather than cold. When cold weather did arrive, Mediterranean buildings with their thin walls, large windows and minimal heating systems could be quite uncomfortable. The people living there had less heavy clothing available and were less psychologically prepared for cold, having less experience with it. However, the shorter, milder winters meant that the challenges were less severe and shorter lived. The growing season was longer, meaning more food could be produced before winter. The need for stored fuel was less because the heating season was shorter. In some Mediterranean regions, winter was actually the rainy season when agriculture could occur, reversing the northern pattern of dormant winter and active summer. In Central and Eastern Europe, continental climates created winters that combined the cold of Scandinavia with the duration and variability of more southern regions. The great forests of these regions provided abundant wood fuel, but the cold could be intense, and the distance from oceans meant less moderating maritime influence. Communities in these regions developed their own adaptations, including the use of ceramic stoves, which were more efficient than fireplaces, and the construction of very sturdy wooden buildings that could withstand heavy snow loads and sustained cold. Alpine regions faced unique challenges related to altitude and the risk of avalanche and isolation. Communities might be completely cut off from the outside world for months, accessible only by dangerous mountain passes that were impassable under snow. Food and fuel stores had to be completely adequate because resupply was impossible, and communities developed highly self-sufficient, carefully managed systems to ensure winter survival. The close quarters and enforced cooperation of Alpine winter may have fostered particularly strong community bonds, as survival absolutely required that everyone work together and look after each other. Coastal communities throughout Europe had the advantage of the moderating influence of large bodies of water, which kept temperatures from dropping as low as they did inland. However, they faced different challenges. Winter storms could be devastating, fishing was dangerous or impossible during rough weather, and salt air meant that buildings and clothing deteriorated more quickly. Coastal communities often relied heavily on preserved fish as a winter food source and developed sophisticated techniques for fish preservation. Urban areas, regardless of region, created their own microenvironments. Cities were warmer than surrounding countryside because of all the human activity, the concentration of buildings, and the many fires burning. Medieval cities must have been nearly as warm in their densest quarters, where buildings packed together and shared walls trapped heat. However, cities also faced unique challenges. Fuel was more expensive because it had to be brought from outside. Housing was more crowded, leading to disease and fire risks, and urban poor had fewer options for self-sufficiency than rural peasants who could at least grow some of their own food. Each of these regional variations reminds us that there was no single medieval winter experience, but rather a diverse set of experiences shaped by local conditions. Yet across all these regions, certain commonalities persisted: the need for adequate shelter, fuel, food, and clothing, the importance of community cooperation, the value of accumulated traditional knowledge about weather and survival, the psychological challenge of enduring months of hardship, the relief and celebration that came with spring's return. Medieval people were not passive victims of their environment, but active problem solvers who developed sophisticated, regionally adapted strategies for winter survival. These strategies were not written in books but embedded in daily practices, in the design of buildings and clothing, in the rhythms of work and rest, in community traditions and religious observances. They represent a kind of practical wisdom that we have largely lost, cushioned as we are by modern technology from the immediate challenges that medieval people faced every winter. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration, we must reflect on what we have learned about medieval winter survival and what it might mean for us today. We have seen that medieval people survived winter without the conveniences we take for granted through a combination of practical ingenuity, communal cooperation, psychological resilience, and sheer determination. They endured discomforts that would send most modern people running for their thermostats, yet they maintained communities and civilization. They raised children and practiced crafts. They worshipped and celebrated and lived fully human lives. What lessons might we draw from this history? Perhaps the most important is simply an appreciation for how much our lives have been transformed by modern heating technology. The ability to maintain comfortable indoor temperatures regardless of outdoor weather is one of the most significant advances in human comfort and survival in all of history. Central heating, insulation, double-glazed windows, modern clothing materials, these things have changed the human experience of winter so profoundly that we can barely imagine life without them. Yet there is also something to be learned from medieval resilience and adaptability. Medieval people could not control their environment, so they adapted themselves to it. They learned to tolerate discomfort, to find comfort in small things, to appreciate warmth all the more because it was precious and not guaranteed. They developed psychological resources, community support, spiritual faith, cultural traditions that helped them endure hardship without losing hope. These are skills and perspectives that remain valuable even in our more comfortable modern world, where different kinds of hardship still challenge us. The communal nature of medieval winter survival is particularly striking. People survived not as isolated individuals but as members of families and communities. They shared warmth, shared food, shared work, shared the burden of winter. The very design of their dwellings and their sleeping arrangements reflected this communal orientation. In our modern world, where individualism is prized and privacy often valued over community, there may be something to relearn from medieval cooperation and interdependence. The medieval relationship with seasons, with the natural cycle of abundance and scarcity, growth and dormancy, is also worth contemplating. Medieval people lived in close connection with seasonal rhythms, their entire lives structured around the demands of each season. Winter was not an inconvenience to be overcome, but a reality to be prepared for and endured. This created a different relationship with time and nature than most modern people experience, a sense of being embedded in natural cycles rather than separate from them. We might also reflect on medieval attitudes toward comfort and difficulty. Medieval people did not expect life to be easy or comfortable. They expected hardship, prepared for it, endured it when it came. This is not to say they enjoyed suffering. The evidence suggests they seized every opportunity for comfort and celebration when possible, but they did not feel entitled to constant comfort, did not view discomfort as an injustice or failure. There may be wisdom in this acceptance of life's difficulties, in the recognition that some hardships cannot be avoided but only endured. The story of medieval winter survival is ultimately a story about human resilience and ingenuity. Faced with life-threatening cold, with limited technologies and resources, with long months of darkness and privation, medieval people found ways to survive. They developed sophisticated solutions to complex problems. They supported each other through communal structures and traditions. They maintained hope and humanity through the darkest, coldest months. They survived, and in surviving they passed on the wisdom and traditions that enabled future generations to survive as well. When we turn up our thermostats tonight, when we sleep warm beneath modern blankets in our heated homes, perhaps we might spare a thought for our medieval ancestors who endured winter with such minimal protections. Perhaps we might feel a moment of gratitude for the technologies that shield us from winter's full force, and perhaps we might remember that beneath our modern comforts, we are still the same creatures as those medieval people, still capable of endurance and resilience, still needing community and meaning, still connected to the seasons and the earth, despite all our technologies. Let us delve deeper still into the lived reality of medieval winter, for there are layers to this story we have not yet fully explored, dimensions of the experience that deserve our attention if we are to truly understand what it meant to face winter at the Middle Ages without the protections we now take for granted. We have spoken of the physical challenges, the cold, the darkness, the constant battle to maintain warmth. But we should examine more closely the specific technologies and techniques that medieval people developed, the ingenious solutions they devised to problems that seemed almost insurmountable. These were not primitive people stumbling blindly through winter, but sophisticated problem solvers who understood their environment deeply and responded to its challenges with remarkable creativity. Consider the fireplace itself, which we mentioned earlier, but deserve a more thorough examination. The development of the chimney and wall fireplace in the 12th and 13th centuries represented a genuine technological revolution, though one that unfolded slowly over generations. Before this innovation, the only way to have fire indoors was through the central hearth, which meant smoke filling the living space. The problem of how to channel smoke out of a building while keeping the fire burning efficiently had stumped builders for centuries. The solution required advances in several areas. First, builders needed to understand how to construct a stone or brick structure that could withstand intense heat without cracking or collapsing. Stone expands when heated, and a poorly designed fireplace would develop cracks, potentially leading to fires spreading into the building structure. The development of specific mortars and building techniques that could handle these thermal stresses took time and experimentation. Second, builders needed to understand the principles of draft, how hot air rises and how a properly designed chimney could use this principle to draw smoke upward and out of the building. The height of the chimney mattered, as did its width and the smoothness of its interior surface. A chimney that was too short would not draw well. One that was too narrow would become clogged with soot. One with rough interior surfaces created turbulence that reduced efficiency. The fireplaces themselves evolved in design over the medieval period. Early fireplaces were simple openings in walls with basic hoods to catch smoke. Later designs incorporated more sophisticated features, splayed sides that helped radiate heat into the room, raised hearths that brought the fire to a more convenient height, fire backs made of cast iron or stone that absorbed and radiated heat, increasing efficiency. Some late medieval fireplaces incorporated flues that could be closed when the fire was not burning, preventing heat from escaping up the chimney. Wealthier households might have multiple fireplaces throughout their residences, but the expense of building and maintaining them meant that even the relatively well-off might have fires in only a few key rooms. The Great Hall would certainly have one, often enormous. The Lord and Lady's private chambers would have their own, but many other rooms, storage areas, servants' quarters, corridors and stairways remained unheated, and moving through a large medieval residence meant constantly transitioning between pockets of relative warmth and zones of penetrating cold. The management of these fireplaces was a skilled task. Keeping a fire burning efficiently required knowledge about different types of wood, about how to arrange logs for optimal burning, about when to add fuel and how much, about how to control airflow. Different woods burned with different characteristics. Oak provided long-lasting coals. Pine burned hot but quickly. Birch bark was excellent for starting fires because of its oil content. A skilled fire tender could keep a fire going steadily through the day and bank it properly at night so it could be revived in the morning without starting from scratch. The soot and ash produced by these fires required constant management. Chimneys had to be cleaned regularly, or they could become clogged and cause dangerous backdrafting of smoke into living spaces. Worse, accumulated soot was highly flammable, and chimney fires were a constant risk. These fires could spread into the building structure itself, potentially destroying entire homes or even whole neighborhoods in cities where buildings were packed closely together. Professional chimney sweeps emerged as a specialized trade, though the work was dangerous and unpleasant. In cities, regulations often mandated regular chimney cleaning, and householders who neglected this duty might face fines. The ash from fireplaces was not simply discarded but put to various uses. It could be spread on gardens as fertilizer, mixed with fat to make soap, or used in various craft processes like tanning leather. Now let us consider more deeply the matter of windows and light, for this was one of the most challenging aspects of medieval winter life. We take for granted that our windows can let in light while keeping out cold, but this combination was nearly impossible to achieve in the medieval period for most people. Glass existed and was used in churches and the homes of the very wealthy, but it was expensive and came in small pieces that had to be held together with lead strips to create larger panes. The glass itself was not like modern glass. Medieval glass was often greenish or greyish in colour, filled with bubbles and imperfections and much less transparent than what we're used to. It let in light, yes, but dimly, and the view through such glass was distorted and unclear. Still, it was vastly better than the alternatives for those who could afford it. Those who could not afford glass, which was most people, faced a stark choice. They could have openings in their walls that let in light but also let in cold air, rain and snow, or they could seal these openings and live in darkness. Most chose a compromise. Small window openings could be covered with various materials, oiled parchment or cloth, which let through some light while blocking wind, wooden shutters, which could be opened during the day when weather permitted and closed at night or during storms, woven screens that blocked some wind while still allowing some light. But all of these solutions were imperfect. Oiled parchment was translucent but fragile and would deteriorate over time. Cloth let in cold. Wooden shutters, when closed, meant complete darkness, or reliance on expensive candles and oil lamps. The result was that most medieval buildings were dim even during the day, and utterly dark at night, and this darkness shaped every aspect of life in ways we struggle to comprehend. Activities that required good light, fine sewing, detailed craft work, reading and writing, could only be done during the brightest parts of short winter days, or by those wealthy enough to afford abundant artificial light. The rest of the time had to be devoted to tasks that could be done by feel or in dim light, or to rest and social activities that did not require vision. The rhythm of winter days was thus powerfully shaped by the availability of light. with productive work compressed into the few bright hours and the long dark periods devoted to eating, storytelling, sleep, and waiting for morning. The psychological impact of this extended darkness deserves deeper consideration. Modern research has established that humans need exposure to bright light for psychological and physical health, that inadequate light can lead to depression, disrupted sleep patterns, and various health problems. Medieval people experienced light deprivation that would be considered severe by modern standards, particularly during winter when days were shortest and indoor spaces darkest. We can see evidence of this in various ways. Medieval religious calendars scheduled major festivals and celebrations during the darkest periods: Christmas near the winter solstice, Candlemas in early February, providing communal gatherings and ritual occasions that broke up the oppressive darkness. These were not arbitrary dates, but responses to genuine psychological needs, offering light, in the form of special candles and fires, and community and celebration precisely when people most needed these things. The veneration of light itself in medieval culture, the elaborate symbolism of light in religious art and literature, the importance of candles in religious ritual, the association of divine presence with illumination, partly reflected the deep significance of light to people who spent so much of their time in darkness. Light was not merely practical, but carried profound emotional and spiritual meaning. We should also examine more closely the social dynamics of winter survival, for winter brought people into unusually close contact, and this proximity created both benefits and challenges. A peasant family living in a single room throughout the winter months had no privacy whatsoever. Parents and children, young and old, all lived and slept in constant view of each other. Personal conflicts could not be escaped by retreating to separate rooms. Tensions that might be relieved in summer by spending time outside or working separately had to be endured and managed within the confined space of the winter dwelling. Medieval families developed strategies for managing this closeness. Social conventions about appropriate behavior were strict, partly to make crowded living possible. Children were taught from earliest age to control their behavior, to be quiet when needed, to respect the limited space and resources available. Adults practiced patience and restraint, understanding that losing one's temper in such confined quarters could make life unbearable for everyone. The hierarchy within families was clear and enforced. The father, as head of household, had authority that was rarely questioned. His position closest to the fire, his portion of food, his decisions about household management, all reflected his status. The mother managed domestic work, overseeing food preparation, clothing maintenance, and the supervision of children. Children had defined roles based on age and gender, with even young children expected to contribute to household work and older children taking on increasingly adult responsibilities. This hierarchy was not unique to winter, of course, but the close quarters of winter made it more important. When everyone must share limited space and resources, clear rules about who has authority over what, who sits where, who gets which portion. These rules prevent constant conflict and make communal living possible. Similar dynamics operated in castles and monasteries, though on larger scales. A castle household might include dozens or hundreds of people, all living in close proximity throughout the winter. The great hall became a stage where social hierarchy was performed daily. The high table where the lord and his family sat, the lower tables for retainers and servants, the specific places where each person sat reflecting their status within the household. During winter, When outdoor activities were limited and everyone was forced to spend more time together indoors, these status markers became even more important. Monasteries had their own hierarchies and rules governing winter life. The rule of St. Benedict, which governed many medieval monasteries, specified in great detail how monks should behave, what they should wear, when they should sleep and wake and work and pray. During winter, when monks spent even more time together in close quarters, these rules became essential for preventing conflict and maintaining the community's spiritual focus. The warming room in monasteries deserves closer examination, for it reveals fascinating details about how even austere religious communities balanced ideals of self-denial with the practical needs of survival. Monks were supposed to embrace poverty and hardship, to mortify the flesh as a spiritual discipline. Yet even the strictest monastic orders recognized that some warmth was necessary if monks were to survive winter and continue their work. The solution was to restrict heating to specific times and places. At Reval Abbey, for instance, the warming room fire was lit on November 1st and kept burning until Good Friday, providing a place where monks could warm themselves during the coldest months. But the fire was available only at certain times of day, and monks were expected to limit their time there, warming themselves just enough to continue their duties without succumbing to the temptation of lingering in comfort. This created interesting tensions between spiritual ideals and physical needs. Monks who spent too long in a warming room might be reproved for excessive attachment to comfort, yet those who avoided it entirely and became too cold to perform their duties were also failing in their obligations. Finding the right balance was part of the spiritual challenge of monastic winter. The diet of monks during winter also reflected these tensions. Monastic rules often specified periods of fasting and restrictions on what could be eaten. During winter, when the body needed more calories to maintain warmth, these restrictions created genuine hardship. Some monasteries modified their fasting rules during the coldest weather, recognizing that excessive deprivation might be dangerous, but others maintained strict observance regardless of season. For monks, winter hardship was not merely something to be endured, but could be embraced as an opportunity for spiritual growth. The cold, the hunger, the darkness, all could be offered up as forms of prayer, as participation in Christ's suffering, as disciplines that purified the soul by detaching it from bodily comfort. This theological framework gave meaning to hardship that might otherwise seem pointless. We should consider more deeply the experience of specific vulnerable groups during medieval winter. The elderly faced particular challenges, as aging bodies were less able to generate and retain heat. Older people needed to stay closer to fires, needed more bedding and warmer clothing, needed more assistance with daily tasks. In some families, the elderly were cared for attentively, their needs met as a matter of duty and affection. In others, the elderly became burdens, consuming resources without contributing labour, and might be neglected or treated with impatience. Medieval society did have some systems for supporting the elderly poor. Almshouses provided shelter for those without family support. Monasteries offered charity and sometimes took in elderly people who had nowhere else to go. Guilds in cities sometimes maintained facilities for elderly former members, but these supports were limited and often inadequate, and many elderly people faced winter with genuine fear, knowing their chances of surviving it were declining with each passing year. Pregnant women faced their own winter challenges. Pregnancy increased caloric needs precisely when food was most scarce. The physical demands of pregnancy were compounded by cold and the need to continue working despite physical discomfort. Giving birth during winter presented serious risks. Cold could be dangerous for both mother and newborn, and the assistance of midwives might be impossible to obtain if weather prevented travel. Medieval people tried to time births to avoid the worst of winter if possible, though of course this was not entirely within their control. A birth in late fall or early winter meant the most vulnerable months of infancy would occur during the coldest season. A late winter or early spring birth was preferable, allowing the mother to regain strength as weather improved and food became more available. Infants and young children were particularly vulnerable to winter cold. Their small bodies had difficulty regulating temperature, and they lacked the understanding to stay near fires or keep themselves covered. Parents kept infants close, often sleeping with them to provide warmth. But even so, infant mortality spiked during winter. Parents of young children spent winters in constant anxiety, watching for any sign of illness that might indicate their child was succumbing to cold or disease. The disabled and chronically ill faced compounded difficulties during winter. Someone with limited mobility could not flee a spreading fire, could not gather their own fuel, might not be able to position themselves near warmth. The medieval period had no systematic support for disabled people. They relied entirely on family charity or, failing that, on broader community support that was often grudging and minimal. Mental illness, though not understood in modern terms, was certainly present in medieval populations and may have worsened during winter. The isolation, darkness, cold, and stress of winter survival could trigger or exacerbate mental health problems. Medieval people attributed such conditions to demonic possession, imbalance of bodily humours, or divine punishment, and treatments range from prayer to herbal remedies to simple restraint if the person became violent or disruptive. Let us also consider the specific experience of travellers caught by winter, for this was a particular kind of hardship. In an age when most trade and communication happened through physical travel, winter dramatically reduced mobility. Roads became muddy or snowy, rivers froze or flooded, mountain passes became impassable. Wise travellers avoided winter journeys whenever possible, but sometimes travel was necessary regardless of season. A traveller caught by winter might seek shelter at monasteries, which were expected to provide hospitality to strangers. The quality of this hospitality varied. Some monasteries were generous, others grudging. A traveller might be given food and a place to sleep near the fire, or might be relegated to a drafty guest house with minimal comforts. In either case, monastic hospitality could mean the difference between survival and death for a winter traveller. Inns existed in towns and along major routes providing paid accommodation. Medieval inns were rough by any standard. A traveller might share a bed with strangers, might sleep on straw on the floor, would eat whatever simple food the inn provided. But even these minimal accommodations were welcome to a traveller who had spent the day struggling through winter weather. The warmth of an inn's fire, the shelter of its roof, the opportunity to dry wet clothing and eat hot food. These were precious during winter travel. Travellers developed their own winter survival strategies. They wore their best wool clothing, brought extra blankets or cloaks, carried fire-starting materials so they could make camp if necessary. They studied weather signs, trying to avoid travelling during the worst conditions. They travelled in groups when possible, knowing that companions could provide assistance if someone fell ill or became too cold to continue. They planned routes that took them through settlements where shelter might be available at regular intervals. Despite these precautions, winter travel was dangerous. People died of exposure when caught in unexpected storms. Travelers fell through thin ice when trying to cross frozen rivers. Some simply became too weak from cold and exhaustion to continue and died by the roadside. Their bodies might not be discovered until spring thaw, and if they carried no identification, they might be buried in unmarked graves with their families never learning their fate. Merchants who needed to transport goods during winter faced additional challenges. Carts became stuck in mud or snow. Pack animals struggled with slippery conditions and could injure themselves or their handlers. Goods had to be protected from moisture, which could ruin cloth, rust metal, or spoil foodstuffs. The reduced trade during winter meant that prices for goods fluctuated seasonally, with winter scarcity driving up prices for many commodities. Rivers, which served as major trade routes during other seasons, became problematic in winter. If they froze solid, they could actually facilitate travel. People and goods could move across the ice. But the period when ice was forming or breaking up was extremely dangerous, with unstable ice that looked solid but could collapse under weight. River traffic essentially stopped during these transitional periods, cutting off commerce and communication between settlements that relied on river transport. Pilgrims travelling to holy sites faced the same winter challenges as other travellers, but with the added complication that some pilgrimages were undertaken as acts of penance, which might mean deliberately travelling during harsh conditions as part of the spiritual discipline. A pilgrim might walk rather than ride, might fast during the journey, might wear inadequate clothing as a form of mortification. This could transform an already dangerous winter journey into something genuinely life-threatening. The seasonal rhythm of agricultural labour also shaped winter experience in important ways. For peasants whose lives revolved around farming, winter was the only season when they were not engaged in intense fieldwork. Summer brought ploughing, planting, weeding, harvesting, constant labour from dawn to dusk. Winter brought a dramatic reduction in necessary outdoor work. This might sound like a benefit, but it created its own challenges. Without regular outdoor work to structure their days, peasants had to find other activities. Some crafts could be pursued indoors. Women spun wool and wove cloth. Men carved wood or repaired tools. But these activities could not fully occupy the long winter hours, and idleness brought its own problems. Boredom, restlessness, interpersonal conflicts, all increased when people had too much time and too little to do. Some peasants took advantage of winter to pursue work that was impossible during the growing season. Wood could be cut when trees were dormant, and snow made it easier to haul logs out of forests on sleds. Ice fishing could supplement food stores. Hunting was sometimes permitted during winter, though hunting rights were usually reserved for nobility. Ditches and fences could be maintained or constructed when fieldwork was not demanding time, but fundamentally winter was a waiting period for agricultural communities, waiting for spring to arrive, for the ground to thaw, for planting season to begin. This waiting required patience and the ability to tolerate inactivity that must have been psychologically difficult for people accustomed to constant physical labour during the growing season. The role of animals in winter survival deserves more attention as well. We have discussed livestock sharing living quarters with humans for warmth, but the relationship between humans and animals during winter was more complex and more important than this single point suggests. Animals had to be kept alive through winter if they were to be useful in spring. Cattle needed for ploughing, horses for transportation, sheep for wool, pigs for meat. All had to be fed through months when no grazing was available. This meant storing enormous quantities of hay and grain. dedicating storage space that might otherwise be used for human food, spending time daily caring for animals even in the worst weather. The decision about which animals to keep alive through winter and which to slaughter in fall was crucial. Animals that could be kept with minimal feed might be preserved for breeding or work in spring. Others would be slaughtered and their meat preserved, providing winter food while eliminating mouths that would otherwise consume scarce fodder. These decisions were not simple economic calculations but involved emotional considerations as well. Animals were not mere property but living beings that people formed relationships with over time. A cow that had been part of the household for years, a horse that had worked faithfully. These were not slaughtered casually. Yet sentiment could not override the mathematics of survival, and animals died so that humans might eat. Dogs and cats earned their keep by hunting vermin, and winter was when their services were most valuable. The grains and other food stored for winter attracted mice and rats, which could consume substantial amounts if not controlled. A good hunting cat or dog was genuinely valuable during winter, and such animals might be fed when food was otherwise scarce, because their contribution to food security justified the expense. Even wild animals played roles in winter survival. Hunting could supplement stored food when permitted, or when people were desperate enough to risk punishment for poaching. Trapping smaller animals, rabbits, squirrels, birds, could provide both meat and fur. However, winter hunting was challenging because animals were scarcer. Snow made stalking difficult, and extreme cold made extended outdoor activity dangerous. The rhythm of animal life shaped human awareness of winter's progression. The departure of migrating birds in fall signaled winter's approach. Their return in early spring announced its ending. The behavior of animals that remained year-round, the thickness of their winter coats, their patterns of activity, provided clues about weather and season. Livestock becoming restless might indicate an approaching storm. Birds gathering and chattering could signal changing weather patterns. Medieval people paid close attention to these signs, incorporating them into folk wisdom passed down through generations. While modern meteorology might question the reliability of such indicators, they represented genuine observational knowledge, patterns recognized through centuries of careful attention to the natural world. We should also examine more closely the economic dimensions of winter. Winter was not simply a season of physical hardship, but also a time of economic challenge when income generation was limited and stored resources were consumed without renewal. For peasants, this was the season when debts incurred during the growing season came due, when rents and tithes had to be paid, when the previous year's economic success or failure became fully apparent. A family that had enjoyed a good harvest would enter winter with adequate food stores, perhaps some surplus to trade, and the means to pay what they owed. They could face winter with confidence, knowing they had what was needed for survival. A family that had experienced crop failure or other misfortune would enter winter already in debt, with inadequate stores, and with little prospect of improving their situation until spring. Debt in medieval society was not handled through impersonal financial institutions, but through personal relationships with creditors who were often neighbours or local merchants. The pressure of unpaid debt was social as well as economic. Creditors would be seen regularly in the small communities where most people lived, and the shame of inability to pay was compounded by this close proximity. Some families survived winter only by borrowing, grain to supplement inadequate stores, money to purchase necessities, favours from neighbours or kin. This borrowing created obligations that would have to be repaid, often with interest or additional service after the next harvest. Families could thus become trapped in cycles of debt that were difficult to escape. The wealthy also faced economic challenges during winter, though of different kinds. A noble household had to maintain its status through the winter, continuing to provide hospitality, supporting its household members, maintaining appearances appropriate to rank. This required substantial resources, and a noble family that had exhausted its reserves might have to borrow from merchants or sell property to maintain itself through winter. Trade and commerce slowed during winter as travel became difficult, and resources were devoted to survival rather than luxury purchases. Merchants who relied on trade for income faced months of reduced business. Craftspeople whose work required materials that became unavailable during winter, dyes that required certain plants, for instance, had to find alternative ways to support themselves. The church played significant economic roles during winter. Churches and monasteries collected tithes from the harvest, accumulating substantial stores of food and other resources. Some of this was redistributed as charity to the poor, though the amounts were often minimal compared to need. The church also provided a kind of insurance system. Families who had contributed to the church in good times might receive assistance during bad times, though this was never guaranteed, and often came with expectations of future service or repayment. Winter was also a time for settlement of accounts and planning for the coming year. Merchants would calculate their profits from the previous year's trading. Lords would assess their estate's production and plan how resources would be allocated. Families would discuss plans for the coming growing season. What to plant, what improvements to make to buildings or equipment, what goals to pursue. These discussions took place around winter fires, during the long evening hours when there was time for reflection and planning. In this sense, winter's forced pause in active work created space for the strategic thinking and planning that would shape the coming year's activities. Let us explore too the religious dimensions of winter more deeply, for medieval Christianity shaped how people understood and responded to winter hardship. The Church taught that earthly life was a time of testing, that suffering was spiritually valuable, that hardship endured with patience and faith would be rewarded in the afterlife. This theological framework helped people make sense of winter suffering, giving it meaning beyond mere misery. Saints' days throughout the winter provided markers of time and occasions for special observance. The feast of St. Martin in November, Christmas in late December, Epiphany in early January, Candlemas in early February. These days broke up the winter into smaller segments and provided occasions for special foods, gatherings, and religious observation. They created anticipation and gave people something to look forward to during the long dark months. Christmas deserves particular attention as the central winter festival. Despite being celebrated as the birth of Christ, many Christmas customs actually predated Christianity, emerging from older winter solstice celebrations. The bringing of evergreen branches indoors, the burning of special logs, the feasting and gift-giving. These practices served both religious and psychological functions, providing celebration and light at the darkest time of year. Midnight Mass on Christmas Eve was for many people the only time during winter when they might enter a church building at night, experiencing the building illuminated by candles, and hear the special music and ceremony reserved for this occasion. For medieval people, this must have been a powerful, almost otherworldly experience, entering the cold, dark night, seeing the church glowing with light, joining in communal worship that connected them to Christians throughout the world, celebrating the same moment. The 12 days of Christmas, from December 25th to Epiphany on January 6th, were traditionally a period of reduced work and increased celebration. This reflected both religious significance and practical reality. The darkest, coldest days of winter were not ideal for work anyway, and using this time for rest and celebration served both spiritual and practical purposes. Lent, which could begin as early as February depending on when Easter fell, imposed additional religious disciplines during a time when people were already stressed by winter privation. The required fasting might seem cruel when food was already scarce, but it also served to extend food supplies by requiring more moderate consumption. The spiritual emphasis of Lent provided a framework for understanding and accepting continued hardship as spring slowly approached. Prayer itself was a tool for managing winter hardship. Regular prayer provided structure to each day, offered psychological comfort, and reinforced community bonds when prayers were said collectively. The belief that God controlled weather and season meant that prayers for milder weather or for protection through winter were not mere superstition, but sincere attempts to invoke divine assistance for genuine needs. The concept of divine providence, the belief that God provided for human needs, helped people maintain hope even in difficult circumstances. The appearance of unexpected help, the luck of finding additional food or fuel, even simply surviving another day, all could be interpreted as evidence of God's care, reinforcing faith and encouraging perseverance. Medieval Christianity also provided a narrative framework for understanding the cycle of seasons. Just as Christ had died and been resurrected, so winter was a kind of death from which spring brought resurrection and renewal. This parallel was not subtle or accidental, but was emphasized in religious teaching and shaped how people conceptualized the relationship between winter and spring, darkness and light, death and life. The promise of heaven offered hope that transcended earthly hardship. No matter how difficult winter became, believers could console themselves with the assurance that this earthly life was temporary and that better existence awaited those who remained faithful. This was not mere escapism, but a genuine source of psychological resilience that helped people endure conditions that might otherwise have broken their spirits. Now, as we approach the final portion of our exploration, we should consider what happened when winter's grip finally began to loosen. When the first signs of spring appeared, and people who had survived the long cold months could begin to look forward rather than merely endure the present. The transition from winter to spring was not sudden but gradual, a slow accumulation of subtle changes that had to be watched for carefully. The sun's path across the sky would shift, rising slightly higher each day, providing a few more minutes of daylight. The quality of the light would change, becoming less flat and grey, taking on the clearer, sharper quality of spring. The wind might shift direction, bringing air that felt different, slightly less bitter, carrying hints of moisture and earth rather than just cold. These changes began well before the last snow melted, well before temperatures rose consistently above freezing. Medieval people learned to read them carefully, knowing that spring was coming, but also knowing that winter could return with deadly force if they grew overconfident too early. Late winter storms could be particularly dangerous because people had exhausted their stores and their psychological reserves, making one final blast of winter harder to endure than earlier ones when energy and supplies had been greater. The first visible signs of life returning to the landscape were greeted with joy that must have been profound. The appearance of the first green shoots poking through snow or frozen ground, the opening of the first buds on trees, the return of the first migrating birds. These were not merely pleasant observations, but signals of survival, confirmation that winter was truly ending, that the family had endured and would live to see another growing season. Foraging for early spring greens became possible as soon as certain plants appeared. These first wild foods, dandelion leaves, nettles, ramps, and various other plants depending on region, were eagerly gathered and consumed. They provided fresh food after months of preserved provisions, but more importantly, they represented hope and renewal. The taste of fresh greens after a winter of dried and preserved food must have been extraordinary, and these foods were often specifically associated with spring celebrations. As the ground began to thaw, the rhythm of work shifted back toward outdoor activity. Fields had to be prepared for planting, and this required timing the work carefully. Soil that was still too frozen could not be worked, but waiting too long might delay planting and reduce yields. Medieval farmers developed deep knowledge of how to assess soil conditions, when it was ready to be worked, when planting should begin. The transition from winter confinement to spring outdoor work was not always easy. Bodies that had been relatively sedentary for months now had to return to hard physical labor. Muscles needed to regain strength and flexibility. The adjustment could be uncomfortable, even painful, but it was also liberating to be outside, to move freely, to work with purpose toward harvest rather than merely enduring winter's passage. For young people especially, the return of spring meant freedom after months of restriction. Children could play outside again, exploring and running and engaging in activities impossible during winter. Adolescents could socialize outside the watchful eyes of parents and elders, could participate in spring festivals and celebrations that often involved courtship opportunities. The associations between spring and romance, youth and renewal, are ancient and were as strong in the medieval period as in any era. Communities would emerge from winter to discover what had changed, which neighbors had survived, which had perished, which buildings had survived winter intact, which had suffered damage, how food stores had held out, which families had surplus to share or trade, which were desperate for help. This knowledge would shape relationships and obligations through the coming growing season. Some families would face spring still in the grip of winter's consequences. Stores exhausted too early meant hunger during these transition weeks. Accumulated debts from winter borrowing had to be addressed. Damage to buildings or equipment had to be repaired before the growing season could begin in earnest. For these families, winter's hardships extended into spring, delaying recovery and creating stress that might carry through the entire year. But for most who survived, spring brought genuine relief and renewed energy. The worst was over. They had endured. Life could begin again. This must have created a kind of exhilaration, a joy in simple things, warmth, light, fresh food, freedom of movement, that we who take these things for granted can barely comprehend. Communities would gather for spring celebrations that acknowledged survival and looked forward to the coming growing season. Some of these celebrations had religious character. Easter, celebrated with special foods and services after the austerity of Lent. Others were more secular, various May Day traditions, spring festivals that varied by region, but often involved communal gatherings, feasting from whatever resources remained, music and dancing, renewal of community bonds that had been strained by winter's pressures. These gatherings served important functions beyond mere celebration. They allowed communities to redistribute resources, families with surplus helping those in need, establishing obligations that would be reciprocated in future. They provided opportunities for young people to socialize and form relationships that might lead to marriages and new households. They reinforced community identity and solidarity after months when isolation had been more common than gathering. The agricultural calendar now moved forward with urgency. Planting could not be delayed beyond optimal times without reducing yields. Animals that had been kept indoors through winter needed to be moved to pasture. Equipment needed maintenance or repair after months of storage. Seeds needed to be selected and prepared. Manure that had accumulated through winter needed to be spread on fields. Every family had long lists of tasks that required completion before the season progressed too far. This transition period between winter's end and summer's establishment was thus a time of complex emotions: relief at winter's passing, exhaustion from the ordeal of survival, anxiety about upcoming work and the uncertainties of the coming growing season, hope that this year's harvest might be better than last year's, grief for those who had not survived the winter, celebration at being alive to see another spring, and through it all, the knowledge that winter would come again, that even as they celebrated winter's ending, they were already preparing for the next cycle, already planning how to accumulate the stores that would see them through the following year. Medieval life was not linear but cyclical, each season preparing for the next, each year's winter shaping how people approached the coming year's challenges. As we reach the end of this extended exploration, we must acknowledge that we have only scratched the surface of medieval winter experience. We have examined the practical strategies and technologies, the physical and psychological challenges, the social and economic dimensions, the religious frameworks that gave meaning to hardship. But each of these topics could be explored in even greater depth, and many other dimensions remain unexplored. The particular experiences of specific regions and time periods, the evolution of winter survival strategies over the centuries, the artistic and literary responses to winter, the ways that winter experience shaped medieval culture more broadly. What we have established, however, is that medieval winter was simultaneously harsher than most of us can imagine, and also more manageable than we might have assumed. Yes, the cold was severe, the darkness oppressive, the hunger real, the danger constant. But medieval people were not helpless victims of winter, but active, intelligent responders who developed sophisticated strategies for survival, who supported each other through communal bonds, who found meaning in hardship through religious faith and cultural traditions, who endured and persevered and passed on their wisdom to enable future generations to survive. Their story is our story, for we are their descendants, and the resilience they demonstrated is part of our inheritance. The winter survival strategies they developed over centuries were successful. They worked. They kept people alive. They sustained communities and civilization through conditions that might have destroyed less adaptable populations. This success enabled the continuation of human culture through generations, ultimately leading to the development of technologies that now shield us from the worst of winter's impact. May we remember as we settle into our comfortable heated homes tonight that comfort is not humanity's natural state, but a hard-won achievement, that the warmth we enjoy so casually was desperately sought by countless generations who faced winter with nothing but their ingenuity, their community bonds, and their determination to survive. May we appreciate the gift of warmth, and may we remember that we carry within ourselves the same capacity for resilience and endurance that enabled our medieval ancestors to survive winter after winter, generation after generation, until finally their descendants developed the means to tame winter's fury. Good night, stay warm, and remember that spring always comes to those who can endure the winter.